So thanks, Ken, and thanks to our panelists. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage. I'm not Ed Luce, pinch hitting for him, but I found that our panelists all know each other, and it seems like they kind of travel in a little bit of a circle where they seem to do this all the time, talking about Brexit. So, yeah, beats working. So as Ken said, you know, the clock is ticking, the end is near, or is it? There's lots of talk about hard Brexit, soft Brexit, somewhere in between. Morgan Stanley did a piece where they said that the cost for GDP loss could be as much as almost 8% or 0, depending on what happens in terms of a hard or soft Brexit or something in the middle. It seemed to me that as I was looking at how to help our panel set the political context for this, that there are a couple of issues. One is that we probably need a little bit of translation. There are a lot of terms that I'm not sure everybody understands, hard, soft Brexit being one of them, but that's just one example. It's a pretty charged atmosphere politically. I watched yesterday Brexit the movie. I didn't have popcorn, but I felt like I needed a scotch as I was going through it. There seems to be a lot more activity as the EU leaders get ready to meet at the end of the month to give some new instructions to phase 2 of the negotiations. And I think our panelists will talk a little bit about that. So I think our goal really is, in terms of trying to set up for the next panel, is to decode what is meant by some of the terms. I mentioned before hard, soft, but there's cherry pick, cakeism, pick and mix, bespoke kind of agreements, and the one that, as a former and recovering trade negotiator, that I loved is the evolution clause, which, you know, for me, it just seemed like it's not over till it's over, and everybody retains their flexibility until the end. But anyway, it has a special name. It does seem to me that as we look to the political context, there's a lot of things going on in Europe that maybe the U.S. isn't watching quite as closely as it should. A lot of speculation about another try, another vote, something else happening, but it doesn't really seem like in the U.S. we are as clued in, perhaps, as we should be, both in terms of what the U.S.-EU relationship should be going forward, but also how we structure our relationship, you know, with the UK. I think a number of people in the room have been in touch with our friends in Britain as they're trying to put together their own trade policy team. A number of us know well Crawford Falconer, who is a superstar on trade matters, and as they build out their team, we're just wondering how that's going to all work. So if you could help us now start with a little bit of the political context, as well as I think you're probably on one side of the Brexit fence as opposed to some of our other friends on the panel. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for the extremely kind invitation to speak to you today. And I'd like to offer a positive vision for Brexit. I think there's far too much negativity out there. I've had a lot of experience working with key British government officials on the Brexit issue. I've also had a chance to work with many members of Congress here in the United States on Brexit, and also with the US administration as well. So in addition to meeting with a very wide range of European delegations from across the continent. So firstly, I'd like to say that Brexit was a vote by the British people to establish sovereignty and self-determination. Over 17 million Britons voted in favour of Brexit. This was a huge turnout. This was an emphatic vote in favour of a sovereign Britain, and all of the predictions of Project Fear that Brexit would result in some sort of economic calamity, that Britain would face a dire sort of future. None of that has come true whatsoever, and the British economy, of course, is in very good shape. UK unemployment is at its lowest level since the 1970s. UK employment is at an all-time high for the modern era. You have now the highest level of foreign direct investment into the UK in the history of the United Kingdom. Exports up 11.5% in 2017, manufacturing up 3.9% in 2017. The best manufacturing order book since 1998. 58,000 UK tech startups in 2017. More venture capital in tech in London in 2017 than the whole of France, Germany, Spain, and Ireland combined. And so, this is the reality, I think, of the economic renaissance that's taking place in the UK, and the outlook for Britain is an extremely positive one, and a huge amount of FDI continues to flow into the UK. No jobs are being lost as a result of Brexit. It's very clear in terms of the position of the British government that the UK will be leaving both the single market and the customs union. You have to be out of the customs union, of course, to negotiate your own free trade agreements, and Britain's already actively in discussions with over 70 countries across the world in terms of advancing future free trade deals which would be implemented once Britain is fully outside of the European Union. Also, Britain is definitely going to be outside of the single market. If you're part of the single market, you can't control your own borders, you can't decide who comes into the United Kingdom, and that was a key issue, of course, of British voters. Sovereignty, retaking control of Britain's borders, extremely important, I think, for the British electorate. And next week, of course, we see the next round of key European British negotiations with regard to the shape of a transition deal. I do think the European Commission is starting to soften its overall approach. I have to say, I think the European Commission has been very hostile and very negative over the past few months or so. That's been a very unproductive approach being taken by Brussels. It's in no one's interest, I think, to have some sort of extremely negative future for UK-EU relations. I think it's everyone's interest to have a good free trade agreement between the UK and the rest of the European Union as it currently is. And it's in the interest, I think, of both sides to have a positive, forward-looking deal. The European Commission seems to be softening its position, for example, with the idea of Britain being able to negotiate and sign free trade agreements during the transition period. The transition period is expected to be at most a 2-year transition. My understanding is it's likely to be shorter than that, probably about, I think, 19, 20 months, something like that is the most likely. But it's just been announced today in the UK that the Commission appears to be softening its position in terms of the negotiation and signing of free trade deals by the UK during that transition period. That's a very positive development. I do think that the big picture outlook for the UK is a very positive one. I think that Brexit is very good news for the United States. We will see, I believe, a stronger US-UK special relationship as a result of Brexit. Brexit will also result in not an inward-looking Britain, but a Britain, I think, that is a real global leader. And of course, Britain has been, for several centuries, a major global power. And I think that the present leadership in the United Kingdom is very much in the mindset of Britain being a truly global actor, not an inward-looking isolationist country. And just this week, the fact that Theresa May has sent a very strong signal to Vladimir Putin that Russian aggression against the United Kingdom or any part of Europe or the free world is unacceptable, that's a very strong signal that Brexit Britain will be a very robust enemy of Putin's Russia. And Brexit Britain, I think, will be a very powerful economic force, but also a very powerful military force and political force on the world stage in close concert with key allies. And so Britain, of course, is fully committed to strengthening the NATO alliance, strengthening, advancing the US-UK special relationship, and, of course, having a very productive relationship with all of the members of the European Union. And so I do think the outlook today is definitely looking very positive, and I think we're on course as well for a US-UK free trade agreement. There have been extensive discussions between the US and UK sides on this. The key figures in the Trump administration on this, Wilbur Ross, Robert Lighthizer, Stephen Mnuchin, have all been very heavily in favour of a US-UK free trade agreement. President Trump has spoken strongly in favour of it. And this will be, I think, a very powerful deal that will further advance prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. And as Stephen Mnuchin recently said, Britain will be at the front of the queue for a free trade deal, in marked contrast to President Obama's very unfortunate intervention ahead of the referendum, where he warned the British people against leaving the EU, and that, of course, completely backfired. So a lot of positive signals being sent by Washington, and you do have a US-UK special relationship at this time that is extremely close, and I expect it's going to be even closer and stronger once Brexit is fully in place. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. And thank you to Ken, to Karl, to everyone involved. I'd just like to make a few points. I guess I come down at a different side of the Nile, which will come as no surprise to him because we've debated this before. But I don't want to deal too much in terms of whether Brexit is good or bad in terms of the future of Britain. I mean, I think that's what the British people have chosen now, not just in the referendum, but also in various parliamentary votes. And I think it will happen, barring a very significant change, which I don't see on the horizon. But I'd like to talk what I think the outcome is going to be, and something on sort of the trade side and the prospects, and then on the US, UK side. I'm pretty worried at the moment that there's going to be no deal. I think when you look at the negotiations and you consider the outstanding issues, particularly the Irish border question, and then the political strategies of London and of the EU, both of which I think are deeply flawed. I think we are headed for a little bit of a train wreck here. London, I think, really still has no idea what it wants. There's been confusion from the very beginning on what Brexit means. We're told Brexit means Brexit, but we don't know if it means leaving the customs union and the single market. That seems to be the case now, but it wasn't sort of all along. There's been a lack of clarity on that. There's been a lack of clarity on the type of trading relationship that Britain would like with the EU afterwards. We're hearing now it may be a Canada Plus style agreement. We've also heard sort of the Norway model, where sort of the UK will stay in the single market and customs union, and that has been ruled out. But the sort of confusion in terms of the actual objective, I think, has been a real problem in terms of the European side, the EU 27, how they negotiate with London. They continually say, we just tell us what you want and then we can negotiate. And London has said, no, tell us what you'll give us and then we'll negotiate. And that dance has been going on for about a year now. I thought the Prime Minister made some progress on this recently in her speech, but I think there's still confusion. On the European side, they've been much more disciplined. They've had a very strong approach. They basically exercise the massive leverage they have because they're much larger than the UK, while individual member states are more dependent on trade with Britain than Britain is with them. In the aggregate, overall, they're far less dependent, and they've hung together, I think, a lot more than London thought they would. London thought that the EU 27 would sort of split up, and they haven't. And so they've been in a very strong position. But as Gideon Rackman pointed out recently in the Financial Times, they have sort of a legalistic approach to this, which is to say, you have to abide by our rules. We get to decide the type of relationship we have with the country that leaves, which is correct legally and even politically speaking, but geopolitically it doesn't really take into account the type of relationship that they want. And so if Britain ends up being a very significant loser from this deal and ends up in a much worse position, that's not actually a victory for the EU 27. The EU 27 may think that they got the better end of the deal, but if it's a Versailles style deal, then that will rebound, I think, in future years. So I'm worried about sort of the negotiating strategies on both sides. But I think then when you look at the issues, the situation is sort of equally dire. I'll just choose one, which is the Irish border question. There are basically three possible outcomes to this problem. All of them have been ruled out. And as Donald Tusk said recently in Dublin, the EU 27 is adopting sort of an Ireland first approach in that border question, which is one of the three key questions that they outlined at the beginning, has to be dealt with before other issues can be. The three options are the UK staying in the customs union and having full regulatory alignment, either formally or practically with the rest of the EU. The Conservative Party, I think, has ruled that out because they believe that would be a violation of the Brexit vote. The second option is that there would be special status for Northern Ireland. That Northern Ireland would have a regulatory alignment or stay in the customs union while the rest of the UK left. And the DUP and some unionist-minded Conservative MPs have ruled that out. And the DUP is the main unionist party in Northern Ireland, and its support is necessary for Theresa May's minority government to actually continue in power. And the third option is for the UK to leave, and Northern Ireland to leave the customs union, and there would be an attempt to try to prevent a hard border, but we would see some infrastructure of controls and a border, which could over time become a hard border. And the Irish government has categorically ruled that out. And there's really, people have been puzzling over this, working on this for months now, maybe even longer, and no one has really come up with an alternative, with sort of a plan D after A, B, and C. And this could really lead to the breakdown of the talks, I think. I think we could see no deal. And Brexit with no deal, a really hard Brexit, I think would be catastrophic for all sides. I think there would be an economic impact there. But at this stage, I think I don't know if it's the base case, but it's pretty close to the base case, actually, until we see real progress. The second point I just want to make is on the trade side. I totally take Niall's point about Britain being outward-looking, wanting to cut trade deals. It just strikes me that deciding to go and try to strike global trade deals now is a little bit like electing a communist government in 1991 after the Soviet Union fell. It's really bad timing. I mean, we are in a populist age where people are rebelling against trade. This is the most anti-trade administration, free trade administration in post-war American history. I mean, President Trump is opposed to free trade. He's opposed every free trade deal signed since World War II. He's on the record as saying that. He's on the record as saying that he believes post-World War II trade policy is a mistake. So the fair trade, not free trade thing is a political term to try to muddy that fact. But he is that way. He's not alone. Throughout Europe and throughout the UK, there are protectionist forces. Theresa May may be a free trader, but Jeremy Corbyn certainly isn't, and he has some political power. There are plenty of other forces in the UK or not. France, Germany, Italy, as we saw recently, these are all countries where populism is on the rise to varying degrees. The UK will have to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU 27 that the five-star movement in Italy have to sign off on. How's that going to work out? So I think what we're looking at, good intentions aren't enough. That in this current climate, trade talks are likely to stall, and I think we're likely to see very difficult talks that probably won't lead anywhere. Not because it's not actually in everyone's interest, but because the particular moment we're living in is such that the veto players have expanded. And the final point I just want to make is on the US-UK side. I'm really worried about this relationship. I think it's actually headed in the wrong direction. I think we could see a real split between the UK and the US in the coming years, and I'll come to why that is in a second, but I just want to say something about the Trump administration's approach to trade. Everyone here is in favour of a trade deal with the UK, but the administration has demanded certain things in the negotiations that are so unreasonable that they will be unpalatable to anyone in Britain. And they have essentially adopted what I've called a predatory approach to Brexit. They believe the UK is weak as a result of Brexit, and they're determined to try to pick up on the remains, or pick up as much as they can out of it. A few sort of data points on that. The EU and the US agreed to divide up their agricultural tariff quotas under the WTO. This is sort of quite a sensitive area. They did this deal back in October or November or so. They presented it to the WTO. It should have been pretty smooth sailing. The US sided with Brazil to stop it because they wanted to try to negotiate a better deal for the US on agricultural import quotas. Recently, the US offered the UK a worse deal on the Open Skies Initiative than it has currently as a member of the EU. We saw Wilbur Ross go to London, and he said that the UK could have a trade deal with the US, but it would need to adopt all US regulations unilaterally and abandon all EU regulations unilaterally. And not even the hardest Brexiteer I know is in favour of that, because they believe it's important to have a close relationship with the EU 27. This would blow that out of the water. And they also want access for US firms to the NHS, which anyone who knows anything about British politics knows that will be a non-starter, and on the services industry, which is really difficult. So I think that what we're looking at is a trade deal that is just going to collapse or not work. And if it actually works, it's going to be counterproductive, because it will be so politically toxic in the UK that it will really damage US-UK relations. But the other reason I'm worried about the relationship is because Nile has said, the government is the British government is very open-minded and outward-looking. Well, it cuts both ways. If you remove the need for regulatory alignment with the UK, you can deregulate or you can over-regulate. And there is a significant chance that Jeremy Corbyn could be elected Prime Minister of Britain. And, we're kidding ourselves if we think he is not going to take advantage of the additional leeway provided to him by Brexit to massively increase regulations in the British economy and to diverge in the UK that way. So I think as we look at this over a 5 or 10 year time frame, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think it's going to stall. I really hope there's an agreement. I think the US needs to do a lot more to intervene in this. The US has a strategic interest in the outcome of Brexit. It can basically live with any deal that the parties agree to, except no deal. And I think it needs to be making that point.